Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jordan. Thank you very much for joining us here today. We're excited that everyone was able to make it to our program today. We apologize for the little mishap that we had with the technology last week, but we're very grateful that everyone is able to join us here today. Before we begin the program today, I just want to take a minute to make sure that we thank our sponsors and our partners of the COSI Science Festival for helping make all of these digital events happen. Especially want to thank Battelle as our visionary sponsor for the entire Science Festival. We thank them so very much for their support of all of these great programs. I'd like to now turn the program over to our great group of presenters and allow them to take it away.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Steve. I'm Director of Sales and Marketing at North High Brewing, and I'm going to run some trivia to get us all started. If you can just put your answers in the chat box, and I will go through them throughout the presentation and announce the winners at the end. There's 10 questions and there's 10 prizes. So at the end, we'll announce the winners, and then we'll be contacting you to get your address so we can send you all the great swag we've collected. The first question I have for you guys tonight is, what is Ohio's #1 industry? I'll give everyone, a little bit of time to answer, and then I'll kind of move on to the next. All right, about 50% of Ohio is classified as farmland. Where in the nation do we rank in terms of how much farmland we have, like state to state? I get to see all the answers come in, so it's very exciting. I'm glad you guys are participating. Thank you. All right, the next question is, hops have been used in beer since the 9th century. In the 21st century, we use hops for bittering and flavor. But what was hops' initial purpose? And you have Nick Zachrich on tonight, he's going to talk about hops. He farms out in Mechanicsburg, which is a straight shot out 70. Hops are grown on what? The answer is not a trellis or a farm. They grow on something specific. And while you're answering that question, I have a little extra tidbit for you. Commercial farms are made up of only female plants. There are no male hop plants on a hop farm. In 2018, Ohio produced 1.4 million barrels of beer. We are ranked 4th in beer production in the United States. What 3 states produce more beer than Ohio? And if you get 2 out of the 3, I might just give it to you. Ohio produces a lot of beer. Approximately how many breweries are in Ohio? Whitney Thompson's on this panel tonight. She works for Origin Malt. North High uses a lot of Origin Malt in our beer. What crop is malt made from? If you've ever drank beer, which I hope that you have, in beer trivia and on a science beer panel, you'll know that when you take a sip of beer, you're not actually chewing on malt. Malt produces what ingredient that ferments, that is fermentable by yeast to produce alcohol? And then because I did trivia and I work for North High, the last two questions are all about North High. North High was founded in what year? We are the 7th brewery to open in Columbus. So clearly Ohio's craft brewery has quite exploded since then. And then lastly, in 2016, North High Brewing received a silver at the World Beer Cup. What beer did we receive a silver medal for? Ben, I'm just going to give you a little shout out. You are not only on top of it, you are one of my most loyal beer orders. You've been faithful through deliveries, and I really appreciate that. So thanks for being on here tonight. Brian Himes, how are you? It's so good that you're on here. Thank you guys for coming. Sorry, I'll try and give others a shout out as I see you in the chat. But we actually appreciate all of you being here. Zachrich and Scott and Mike and Whitney and Jason McKibben, our brewmaster, is on here as well. We appreciate you guys coming out tonight to kind of listen to us and learn more about the brew process and local ingredients. That's very important. I'm a 5th generation farm girl, so I try to keep it as local as possible. So we appreciate you guys being here tonight. Our trivia sponsors are the Ohio Craft Brewers Association and North High, which means that that's not funny, Sarah Haggerty. We all know I'm a Miller High Life drinker should I switch from craft beer. So I'm sorry, the trivia sponsors are Ohio Craft Brewers Association, North High Brewing. So I'll go through your answers here as we get started and announce the winners at the end. And you guys will all be receiving either swag from the OCBA or North High. I'm gonna hand it off. Welcome to Science Bar Talk Happy Hour.
Okay, I'd like to introduce myself as the Master of Ceremonies for this program. I'm Mike Estadt, the Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator for OSU Extension in Pickaway County. More on that later. So I'd just like to ask you to pour yourself another beer, grab some munchies, and sit back and enjoy the program. So if you do have questions, please use the chat box. We'll go through them at the end of the program. But first, I'd like to thank Megan Thoreau, my co-worker, who does STEM education in our schools in Pickaway County, for being the driving force behind this afternoon's program. She's going to be kind of in the control center tonight, this afternoon, working through the slides, but I'd like to give Megan a shout out for all the hard work and organization she's done to get this program going tonight. Next slide. But we also would like to thank some of our sponsors, local sponsors that made the program possible. Metzger Family Farms, Origin Malts, the Ohio Small Grains Marketing Program, the Ohio Craft Brewers Association, Watt Street Tavern, my employer, the Ohio State University College of Food, Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, Northside Brewing, the Ohio Farm Bureau, the Zachrich Hop Yard, and of course, our leading supporter, the COSI Science Festival. The planning committee is very appreciative of all these local sponsors, and especially of the folks that took time out of their busy schedules tonight to be on our panel. Next slide, please. Even though this is a free program tonight, we hope that you might consider supporting the servers and brewers that have found themselves severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic here in Ohio. Grab a pen and a pad, and we'll put these sites up for you at the end of the program again, so that if you feel the desire to make even the smallest donation, it'd be greatly appreciated. Next slide. This afternoon, you're going to hear from a great lineup of speakers, from the farmer that's growing the barley clear through to the brewer, and some of the other people that are important along the way. We have Scott Metzger, who he and his family farm corn, wheat, and soybeans in Pickaway and Ross counties. And he's gonna join us tonight from the cab of his tractor, where he's probably either planting corn or soybeans tonight. I'm gonna talk a little bit about some research. We have Whitney Thompson, who's the procurement manager for Origin. Nicholas Zachrich, who he and his wife grow hops out in Mechanicsburg. And then Jason McKibben, who's going to be our last speaker and talk about the brew process. Next slide, please. So let's start with Scott, the farmer. Scott, welcome to the presentation. I'm going to turn them over to you.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. Like Mike said, my name's Scott Metzger. I am a sixth generation grain farmer. We farm in south central Ohio, just about 45 minutes straight south of Columbus. We raise soybeans, corn, wheat, and malt and barley. That's a little bit about me. And actually, Mike is correct. I'm actually sitting in the tractor now. I've been planting corn today. So we've got both planters, one planter is planting corn, the other planter is planting beans. So we're just got started yesterday on corn, and we've been planting beans for a little while now. So next slide. So I'm going to talk about barley today and what goes into growing it. Barley is a fall seeded crop. It's planted in the first week of October, usually October 1st through the 10th or 14th down in our area. In the slide there, the first slide on the left, or first picture on the left, that's how we unload the barley into our seed tender. And then the middle picture there is loading the drill up, and the picture to the right with the tractor is the tractor and the drill, and that's what we use to sow the barley. It's in 7.5-inch rows, and we work the ground one time with it, and then we'll go in and sow it, and then that's the start of the process from the field going to the table, so, or to the drink, I guess I should say. Next slide. Next slide. So as it grows in the fall, I'm sorry, go back one slide. I think you went one too many. Yeah, there we go. So as it comes up in the fall, usually takes about 10 days to 2 weeks, and the barley will look like it does in the picture there on the left. Sometimes in the fall we will spray a fungicide on it and some herbicide for weed control. Just kind of depends on what's out there. And then as it overwinters, it'll kind of turn a very light collard green, pale collard green. And the slide on the picture on the right hand side there is once you get into the kind of the March time frame, the barley will actually come out of dormancy. It just kind of basically just lays there and does nothing throughout the winter. And once we start getting some warmer temperatures in March, it'll break dormancy, and then that's when we start our spraying process. So we'll go in and spray. We spray nitrogen on it, which helps it grow. And usually middle to third week of March, and then we'll make another pass on it with a herbicide, and then you kind of get this time frame. Actually, Monday I just sprayed ours with fungicide and insecticide on it to help control any insects that are in it or any diseases that they have. And it'll be unique this year with the cold temperatures we've had to see how it's going to affect the barley since it was heading out. Next slide. And as you can see on the left-hand side there, when I was talking about it heading out, that's the anthers are sticking up. That's what those are called. And then in the middle picture there is actually barley head itself. This is a 2-row barley on it, so that means there's two rows of barley on each head there. Next slide. And then as we progress into the summertime, usually towards the middle of June, that's when we get that's when we combine it, and it goes into the bin and then stays there until it goes to the elevator later in the summer. So that is a quick tutorial of how barley is grown and raised in South Central Ohio.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And so everybody, if you have questions for Scott, let's put them in the chat box and we'll address them at the end of the program. So if we could go to the next slide. Again, I noticed it's my turn. So I work for Ohio State University Extension, which is the outreach arm of the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. Extension has a presence in all 88 counties of Ohio, delivering programs in agriculture, family consumer sciences, community development, and 4-H. We're responsible for disseminating and applying research to address issues important to the citizens of Ohio. So I would just like to briefly show you how we are supporting making better beer in Ohio. And this slide here, if you're not familiar with, this is Hoster Brewing in downtown Columbus. They're on the left. And that was one of the larger breweries in Ohio in its day. And the great thing about that building is that I know it's being repurposed, and I can't wait to be able to go back to Hoster Brewing and enjoy it in a reuse. And then again, the slide there on the right is North High Brewing and their brew room. So next slide, please. I'm somewhat of a history buff, and so I want to give a little bit of history, not only of the college, but of barley in Ohio. This is University Hall. Ohio State University is celebrating its sesquicentennial this year. This is a picture of the University Hall in 1874. The first class of Buckeyes to come through there numbered 43. That's a big difference from the 13,000 that were virtually conferred degrees a couple weeks ago. In 1870, the Ohio General Assembly chartered the Ohio Agricultural and Mechanical College. The Ohio legislature utilized funds from the sale of land acquired under the Morrill Act to finance the institution. In 1862, the United States government approved the Morrill Act, and it was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln. This piece of legislation authorized the federal government to give each state and territory that had not seceded from the United States during the American Civil War 30,000 acres of land for each U.S. senator and representative currently serving in the U.S. Congress. And individual states were then to use the proceeds of the sale of this land to establish colleges. So if there are any OSU grads out there tonight, if you ever wondered how Lincoln and Morrill Tower got their name, you do now know. So let's look back and see what malting barley production was when the Ohio State Agricultural and Mechanical School was founded. Agricultural statistics indicate that in 1871, barley was planted on 81,000 acres in Ohio, producing approximately 2 million bushels total. There were a lot of breweries in Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland that utilized this barley. Today, that number is down to around 5,000 to 6,000 acres, and we're hoping to grow that in the near future. Next slide, please. OSU Extension and the Agricultural Research and Development Center, the research component of our college, is working to identify malting barley varieties that are best suited for our environment. Disease resistance, insect tolerance, and yield potential are but a few of the characteristics that people and professors like Dr. Laura Lindsay and, and Eric Stockingers and others are investigating. This is a relatively new publication, just came out a couple years ago, that is designed to help growers like Scott grow profitable barley in Ohio. Next slide, please. The College of Food, Ag, and Environmental Science has research facilities located throughout the state that allow for research in different climates around the state. County Extension educators use this replicated research to help growers determine best cultural practices for malting barley production in Ohio. Also, a recently published malting barley budget was published to be used by farmers to determine the economics of growing malting barley on their farms. This is a picture of Eric Stockinger, and he's our barley breeder at Worcester. And this was a shot taken, I think 2 years ago at our Ohio Small Grains Field Day. And we like to encourage growers and potential growers to come in to field days a lot to see research at work. Next slide. So I'd like to turn the program now over to Whitney, and she's going to talk about malting. Whitney, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. My name is Whitney Thompson, and I am the procurement manager for Origin Malt, and I'm going to speak with you today about malting quality barley. I'm also going to turn off my video because I do experience some bandwidth trouble, so bear with me here just a moment. All right. And thank you to COSI and OSU and all of our sponsors for supporting this program. So I wanted to show a really neat picture of a barley field last year. In fact, this is actually Scott's field from last year. And each year we have a field day for our customers where they come out and they view the origin of their malt. So this is barley that's in the field. You'll see that it has kind of this green, but also starting to turn a beautiful golden color, which indicates that it's getting close to ripening. It's in the process of ripening. So it's ready, it's getting close to being ready for harvest. So when Scott harvests his barley and delivers it to our elevators, we convert that barley into malt. So let's switch it over to the next slide. So what is malt? Malt is the soul of beer. And I say that because malt is the backbone of the flavor components of beer. It provides the sugars and the yeast that's needed to ferment and gives the brewer either a really delicate or a really bold flavor canvas to build from to make their final delicious beer. So the definition of malt is barley or other grain that has been steeped, germinated, and dried, used for brewing or distilling or even vinegar making. And we'll learn a little bit more about this process as we go. The variety that is selected is exceptionally important for malt. And I say that because it has to work specifically for 3 different users. It needs to work for the farmer, so it must grow well in the fields and have moderate disease tolerance and winter hardiness. As Scott mentioned, he grows a winter type barley. Puffin is the winter type barley. But there's also spring varieties that are grown in other parts of the country. The variety that is used also has to work for the maltster from my organization so that barley properly converts to a usable malt product. And then the third user that it needs to work well for is the brewer, so that the brewing process can result in a proper and flavorful fermentation. So as Mike mentioned, it's really important for us to have breeders and researchers studying appropriate barley varieties for malting. So we're really thankful to be working with Dr. Eric Stockinger that you saw in the picture earlier and his OSU colleagues. In this picture to your right, you'll see a photo of our primary variety that I've been talking about, Puffin. You'll see that it has these beautiful purple stripes that are characteristic of the barley and its natural lineage. Puffin performs well in the fields and has been making delicious malt and beer that our brewers in the region have been enjoying. And as Kelsey mentioned, North High is one of those. It's extremely important that we start with the healthy, high quality barley from harvest. So meeting quality requirements for malt is really critical. And at Origin Malt, we have a dedicated lab that ensures that the barley we receive is of the highest quality. It's also extremely important to us that we provide our growers with resources to help them have a successful crop. So we can switch to the next slide. So steeping is the first step of the malting process. Once growers harvest the barley, they deliver their malting quality barley to elevators where the barley is stored for a period of time as it rests through its dormancy period, which I call sleeping barley, just to kind of give it a special term there. Scott also mentioned dormancy because this is a winter variety, so the barley does go to sleep in the field. It goes through dormancy. And then it also needs to go through a dormancy period after it's harvested. So you can compare barley in dormancy to like a deciduous tree, as after the leaves come off the tree in the fall, that tree goes into dormancy and rests while it builds its vigor to grow when spring arrives. Barley's the same way. It needs a period of rest before we can turn it into malt, or in the fields before it can turn into a proper crop. Our barley needs to rest for about 4 to 5 months before it's actually ready for steeping. But once the barley breaks dormancy or is ready to germinate, we start the malting process and transfer into steeping tanks for about 36 to 48 hours. So we'll switch to the next slide. So in these steeping tanks, the maltster adds warm water and oxygen to waken up the barley seed. The moisture content rises from about 12% moisture to almost 50%, which is quite substantial. You can think about this process in the same way that you grow garden or flower seeds in your own home or in your own flower beds. The seed must have moisture to grow, but you have to have the right amount of moisture and oxygen to ensure that the seed stays alive. And this is really critical in the malting process. The seed has to stay alive when it comes to us. If it's dead, we can't turn it into malt. So the picture on the left is a line of steeping vessels, and on the right is a picture of the top of steeping vessels. So the top of the vessels are actually open to allow oxygen to flow up through the top of the barley. And another way to think about the steeping process is comparing it to a hot tub. Barley is added to warm water, and there's lots of bubbles because oxygen is added to the process. During the steeping process, the water is added and removed several times because barley's alive. If you saturate it too much, and you've probably experienced this with garden seeds or flower seeds, it can drown and it won't germinate. So it'll die. So it's really important that we get the moisture content just right before the next step, which is germination. So let's switch to the next slide. So once the barley has enough moisture and time in steeping, the barley is transferred to germination beds. In these special vessels, the barley starts to grow rootlets, again, similar to traditional garden or flower seeds. You can see in the picture below from left to right that in about 4 days, once we transfer to the germination vessel, the rootlets grow so that they're almost the same length as the barley kernel itself. The picture on the right is a closer picture of how these kernels start to look after just a few days. Now, the rootlet growth isn't the only thing that's happening with the barley seeds at this point. Inside the seed, there's a very unique and special biochemical change that's occurring. There's these little enzymes, I like to call them little Pac-Mans, that are being released inside the seed that chew on complex carbohydrates to make more simple carbohydrates or complex sugars that are needed for the brewer in the brew house, which you'll learn a little bit more about later from Jason. So next slide. Get to the next slide. Oh, there we go. There we go. Almost. Back one. Perfect, thank you. So these are germination beds. On the left, you can see how the barley loads into the germination bed. And then to even out the bed, which is needed for a couple reasons. It's needed for proper aeration because the barley produces carbon dioxide while it grows. So if a lot of carbon dioxide builds up on the barley, that can kill it as well. We talked about too much water. Same thing can happen with too much carbon dioxide. So there are these special large screw augers that are lined up in a row across the width of the bed that travel up and down the bed to ensure evenness. In addition, these turning machines are necessary to ensure that the rootlets of the barley don't grow together, because if there isn't any turning, then the barley rootlets will bind together and turn into a giant brick of barley, which is not good. It's not what we want. So turning the barley during germination is really important as we get this young malt through to its next step, which is drying. And the way the maltster identifies that is by looking at the kernel. There's some analysis that can occur, but typically once the rootlet is almost the same length as the single kernel of barley, that's when you know that you're pretty much finished with germination. So we can switch to the next slide. All right, so drying is the last step of the malting process. And this is what's necessary to stop those biochemical reactions that I was talking about that were occurring inside the kernel. It also gives malt its final color determination. So there are two types of drying. You have kilning, where dry air is blown on the barley, or you have roasting, which is exactly what it sounds like coffee. So during this drying process, either kilned or roasted, there are simple sugars that will caramelize in the presence of heat. A similar way to think about this process is when you caramelize onions, actually. So after the onions have been on the heat long enough, they start to brown because of the sugars that are present in the onion. And this is the same process that's occurring in the kilning or roasting of barley to get that color increase. And this chemical reaction is called the Maillard reaction. Another important note to make is that caramelization increases flavor. The more color you have, the more flavorful the malt. You can see in this picture the different degrees of malt color. So lighter malt will have flavors like grape nuts, like the cereal grape nuts, grass and light caramel. The darker malt will have notes of chocolate or roasted coffee because it's roasted. An important item to note here is that malt color also equals beer color. So the lighter the malt you have, the lighter the beer will be. The darker the malt you have, or the brewer puts in percentages of darker malts to get to that darker color. There's some exceptions here, like when brewers add fruit purees, so then you start to see hues that are not related to malt, like maybe some pinks or purples, but for the most part, malt is the reason that your beer is the color that it is. Next slide. So this is an example of an exceptionally large kilning vessel. You can see how big it is by the picture on the left. Over towards the right center of that picture, you can see a man inspecting the kiln, and the leveling machine is almost to his shoulders. The middle picture shows the barley loading into a circular kiln, and then the picture on the right shows the barley after leveling when it's in the process of receiving hot air from the bottom of the vessel, which rises through the grain and dries the fresh malt down to a moisture content, and you get that color creation that we were talking about. The turning machine is also important in this process because it evens out the drying process of the kernels. So after this, the process is complete. This process takes about 24 to 48 hours, and then the fresh malt is transferred to the silos where it rests for about 14 days before it gets shipped to the customer. And then next slide. So now the malt is ready for delivery and is typically shipped in several different ways. You have the bags that are shown in the left photo that are being received by the Noctera Brewing team in Powell, Ohio. There's also a larger bag called a tote that holds about 2,000 pounds that some brewers prefer. And then there's bulk options like the truck delivery in the photo on the right, which are very common. And some customers even take their delivery by rail car. So that's the malting process in a nutshell. From here, we'll move onward to learn about the spice of beer, hops. Thanks for learning with me, everybody.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you very much. I'd just like to include one more slide on some research that our college is doing. This is a shot of the hop yard at the OSU South Centers in Piketon, Ohio. And our researchers down there, mainly Brad Bergerford, I think I've been doing, hops research for about the last 5 to 6 years. And so again, we like to utilize these facilities to bring growers in. So just another way Ohio State University is trying to help make a better beer in Ohio. So I'd like to now introduce Nicholas Zachrich. And Nick and his wife Mallory I think Nick's gonna talk about their operation there in Mechanicsburg. So Nick, thank you very much for being part of today.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And actually, his research down in Piketon has been longer than 6 years, Mike. So you're short selling Brad a little bit there, but I won't tell him you said that. I also work at Ohio State University in a different capacity. So all my comments here are on my personal life. So not representing OSU in this role, I guess, but kind of am because I'm employed by OSU Extension. So my wife and I started a hop yard a few years ago. And much of the information we received was from Brad and Ohio State and others. So there's a lot of hop growers in the state. It changes all the time. The Ohio Hop Growers Guild is where we received a lot of our information. There's some growers that have been in the business for 7 or 8 years now and are still doing well. There's been a lot of people that have started and decided it wasn't for them for many various reasons. And I'll discuss some of the challenges that we face in Ohio. So most hops are grown in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So that's Washington, Oregon, Idaho, a little bit Northern California. So those are the major hop growing states in the United States. It's becoming much more popular in the Northeast and across the northern states of the United States. It's a little bit easier to grow in the northern states than it is the southern, but there are some hop growers in southern states like Florida and North Carolina. So it can be grown just about anywhere. There's just more challenges and different challenges in those parts of the country. So I'll talk a little bit about the physiology of hops, not going into too much detail, but just to give a general overview. So that picture was taken from our yard, and we do help provide some of the hops for the cover crop beer partnership with collaboration with Ohio Farm Bureau that North High puts out. So excellent beer there. Try that one out if you haven't had it yet. So what are hops? They are a perennial flowering type plant. The big word there is dioecious, and what Kelsey was saying during the trivia was all of the plants are female plants out there. They are what produces desirable cones. And the running joke is, in much of the world that men are only good for the breeding process. So we need males to be able to breed new varieties, and they're pretty much useless for anything else. And we don't want males near our yards because we don't want those hops to be fertilized. We don't want the characteristics of the cones to change, and we don't want them to crossbreed. There are many different varieties of hops used for different purposes. Bittering and aroma are the two main goals in flavoring of beer. The flowers that we refer to as burrs on the plants are what's going to become the cones. So as you can see in the picture there, those little white, yellowish flower looking things, those are considered flowers. They're called burrs in the hop world. They contain the lupulin glands once they produce into a full cone that produce the oils, which will make the flavor. They're primarily used as an ingredient in beer, but they are used for some other things, and also some of that trivia that Kelsey had. They can grow to more than 20 feet, but they do need some help. They need something to climb. So in the production world, we erect a trellis and use different types of strings. Some people use wires. There's a lot of different things you can use, but they grow up those strings towards the top. So they want to follow the sunlight. We can go to the next slide. There's a picture of our yard too. You can see the cables up top. So they're climbing up those strings. The climates are, the climate in Ohio was what makes it so difficult to grow mostly, but the pests as well. So there's different mildews and other diseases we have to be careful of, and also some of the insect pressures that we have in Ohio are a little bit different than they have in Pacific Northwest and other parts of the world that grow hops. There are currently over 50 growers in the Ohio Hop Growers Guild, representing about 100 acres of hops. And there's a lot of stats going around, but really it's about 1%, actually less than 1% of the hops used in Ohio are produced in the state. So there is a lot of room for hops production in the state. You know, the price for a local hops is a little bit higher than the commodity sized hops that you get from Pacific Northwest, but locally produced is very important to a lot of the brewers in the state for sustainability reasons and many others. But also, you know, there's a lot of shipping costs to getting them here. So there is some value in that, especially for some of the smaller breweries, if you're looking for local ingredients. So one of the advantages we do have is there's a little bit of terroir. So bring in some of that grape terminology. We always hear about that in the grape world, but the soils we have in Ohio and the way that we grow things here, it makes the taste of the hops in the beer a little bit different than some of the hops grown in the Pacific Northwest. So what I'm saying is Cascade, which is one of the most commonly grown hops in the United States, which is also used in the cover crop beer. The hops that we would use off of our farm in Ohio or other farms in Ohio would taste different than the hops from the state of Washington. We can go to the next slide. So the other challenges that we need to talk about. So the plant health is the biggest thing. So I talked about disease pressure and insects. Water is the limiting factor that most growers have a struggle with. So you need to have a great source of water. And having water at the right pH, and there's other factors there. If you have hard water, if you're using pond water, there's different considerations you have to make to have your good, clean irrigation water. There's a high startup cost, so our trellis did cost quite a bit of money. Of course, that's only a one-time cost, hopefully, if you build it properly the first time. And irrigation has a cost to it to be able to bring the water to the plants. The plants themselves can last many, many years. We've been to a yard in Germany that had plants that are 40 years old and still producing great. So we have a lot of longevity there. And there's also some specialized equipment though. So even if you are producing something on the farm, it could be challenging to add this as something else additional to the farm. So advantage Scott has in this situation is he has a lot of the equipment he needs to plant barley and harvest it, where most people don't have the equipment to harvest hops or to spray hops. A lot of different things there. Product handling is also a challenge. A lot of people will try to sell their hops wet, which means they will sell them fresh off of the vine, which that's a great thing, but that's a very specialized industry and you have to get it harvested quickly, efficiently, and a lot of other considerations there of working with the brewer and getting the timing right, and it's very difficult to do. So a lot of the hops, almost all hops are dried, and so there needs to be a way for the drying. Most people bale those in order to get it to a processor or until they can process it themselves. And then there's also the processing. So the finished product isn't the cones that you see. It gets hammer milled and then put into pellets. So if any of you are familiar with pellets that you would feed to like rabbits or goats or other animals, that looks very similar. Of course, when you open it up and you smell it, you can definitely tell it's not alfalfa, it is hops. Very strong aroma when you pelletize the hops. And then there's also the challenge for some of the direct marketing. So there isn't a hop broker. You can sell hops to a broker and sell it that way, but then you're losing more profit as well. So with slim margins, it's very difficult to make the process work in just a few years for hops. It's a long-term investment. And beer trends will also affect that marketing as well. So a common beer that's available now may not be what's trendy in a few years, but the hops, like we said, is a perennial crop. So it's out in the field, and if it's hard time selling it to brewers that aren't wanting that variety of hop anymore, then pretty much the only option then is to tear them out and put in a new variety, which takes a few years to get them to full maturity again. So hops take about 3 years to really become mature and harvest a real full crop like you should each year. Do I have one more slide? Nope, that was it. So I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Nick. We have with us now Jason McKibben, and Jason is the brewmaster there at North High. Jason, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Looking forward to hearing how you take all these ingredients grown by great people here in Champaign and Pickaway County and make them into a good beer. I think Jason just needs unmuted.
Jason, it says that you're unmuted on my end. Can you say hello?
I think we're good. Go ahead.
Sorry, Jason, I can't hear you, so I'm not sure if we have the correct microphone selected. So maybe down in the bottom left of your Zoom window, see if we can pick the microphone there. That might help. Yes, Jason, if you are having a problem with the computer there, it is possible to also call in from a phone. So if you have a phone you can grab real quick, you should see the phone number in the email that was also sent to you.
If it's, and as we wait for Jason to join us by phone, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to look at a little bit of some of the questions. I'm going to address one in particular I think I can handle. There was a question regarding, I think it was from Thomas, regarding barley research and variety trials. Yeah, Eric is doing a lot of work with Origin and with the Puffin variety, but I have been through his variety trials, and they are screening numerous other different varieties of hops. And they're also doing some crossbreeding programs with these different styles of hops. Maybe look for Laura Lindsay and Eric to be publishing those variety trials here in the near future. Also, there was a question about, it was addressed to me about Hoster Brewing. If you're familiar there with the German Village area, when you come off of 70 there, the old Wasserstrom building, that was Hoster Brewing. I mean, it's gonna be a mixed retail residential facility. I sent a link, I think, to everybody about that redevelopment.
Hey, Mike, can you hear me now?
Yep, I hear somebody.
All right, this is Jason. Sorry about that, guys. I've been listening to this call the whole time and didn't realize my
Jason, welcome aboard. Looking forward to your talk.
All right, thanks. I can't see the slides, so I'm just going to have to go by audio here. But I wanted to say, the panelists, every panelist has done a great job kind of describing their impact on the raw materials that we as brewers use to make beer. And what they do is so critical to deliver the flavor that we, leverage from these raw materials in the beer making process. And, I really salute all of them for the great job that they do. When it comes to what we do as brewers, brewing is basically a two-step process in its most fundamental form. And before I even describe that, I want to say that, the beer industry has kind of co-opted this word brewing, but brewing is not specific to making beer. It's really hot water extraction of plant material. That's why you can brew coffee, and you can brew tea, and you can brew soy sauce. All sorts of things can be brewed. We just in brewing somehow, or beer making somehow called brewing, or beer making brewing, and I guess, I don't know, we're being selfish about that, but what it refers to really in the beer making process is the first step of the 2 steps. So step 1 is creating a fermentable liquid. The Germans name that wort, spelled W-O-R-T, and really it's a process where we take the malted barley and we take the hops, and at different stages of the process blend them with water, and we get this really nice sugary fermentable liquid that if we follow all the steps, it'll make for a great substrate for yeast to make into beer. And that brings me to step 2, which is fermentation. So fermenting the wort is step 2, and that's really, those 2 steps will make a beer. And when it comes to going back to the first step is where Ohio ingredients really play their part. So when we're going to start making beer, we weigh out our grains, the malted barley, and if we use any other adjuncts like wheat, which I'll talk about in a minute, they come in whole. One of the great things about making beer is that there's not a lot of ingredients, but the variety that maltsters can treat the malt, the barley can create a tremendous amount of flavors, and there are a lot of varieties of hops, and they all have their different components and ability to bitter beer and also lend certain aromas to beer. But really, other than malted barley, hops, water, and yeast, that's all we need. So it's such a simple list of ingredients that can create so many different flavors. It's really kind of a tribute to why beer is so special. But basically, in step 1, it's the water, the malt, and the hops, and all the grains come in whole. We crush them and then blend them with warm water, and that's the first step of the brewing process, where we're making a mash, and it looks a lot like the consistency of oatmeal. There's a lot of enzymes that have been generated during the malting process of barley that are still very active, and they will chomp the starches into little fermentable sugars. Whitney kind of touched on that. And given enough time at the right temperature, say about 150 degrees, we'll have a very fermentable wort, but it's still entrained in the mash, in the still solid grain particulate. So we basically strain that off, collect that in a kettle, raise that to boil, and we boil typically for an hour. It could be as long as an hour and a half if we wanted to make a strong beer. But that boiling process changes the flavor. Whitney kind of touched on that too, about the Maillard reaction, caramelization. There's reactions happening like that in the kettle boil too, as well as, we're concentrating the wort because we're evaporating water. We're sterilizing it, so any bacteria that comes in from the raw materials is killed, so there's no competition for the yeast. We're evaporating off plant-based flavors that don't taste all that great, that are pretty much native to most plants. One of them is called dimethyl sulfide. Smells like cream corn or sprouts. Really don't want our beers to taste like that, so it will freely evaporate if we add enough heat. And then the boil is also where we add hops. And so hops, as Nick touched on, can add aromas and also can add bitterness. We want both. And each hop will lend a certain character to the beer. So if we want the bitterness out of a hop, we'll add it in the beginning of the boil to, most efficiently extract that bitterness. If we like the aromas, then we want to minimally boil it. We want it the hop to infuse into the beer or into the wort, but not necessarily boil off, because it will. So we'll add those right at the end of the boil, and or even in the whirlpool, which is what we do after the boiling process. So a lot of the aromas will stay in. Nick's hops, we use Cascade. Cascade's a nice hop, a nice, very versatile hop. It's kind of the granddaddy of the American craft beer movement. I used to work for Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, and Fritz Maytag at Anchor in the 70s was very instrumental in creating, or recreating, I would say, traditional beer styles from England primarily. And he actually made a beer in 1975 called Liberty Ale that was hopped only with Cascade, which was a brand new variety back in the mid 70s. and he dry hopped with Cascade, and that was dry hopping is when you add the hops to the fermenter. And so, it's really been awesome to, see where what that variety has done for the industry. And Sierra Nevada took it from there and really popularized Cascade. And I'm happy to use it. I think it's got a nice, piney, Nick's, hops in general too, or in particular, pininess, is kind of an herbal undertone, maybe a hint of lemon. And they're really great. And, if for anybody who's had cover crop, they might not be able to tell or notice a ton of hops in that beer. I brewed that, specifically to have as wide appeal as possible. But, there's definitely an undertone that the hops lend that the cover crop beer that I think is great in that beer. So in general, North High uses all of our base malt is from origin, except for a couple of specialty varieties and seasonals. And we love that malt. It's, as we Scott discussed, it's a winter varietal. The winter barleys have a little bit tougher husk. So I think they have a little bit more flavor. And, I've talked with Whitney, about the flavors. There's kind of a nuttiness in there. It's a richer tasting malt for a base malt than your typical spring barleys. But I think it's great, and it's still really versatile, and it just adds a little bit more depth and flavor to our beer. Cover crop is a salute to the 100th anniversary of the Ohio Farm Bureau, which was last year. And we used origin malt in that, and we also blended it with Rustic Brew Farm, so Matt Cunningham up in Marysville. He grows a different variety called Violetta, but same thing. It's a winter varietal, and I think they've married really well together to make a great beer. And then you throw in Nick's hops, and I think it's a real tribute to the agricultural industry in Ohio and what they've been able to do to use their land to create great beer. And then we also make another beer that showcases some other ingredients too. So we make a beer called Honey Wheat, which is an ale, and it uses origin as our base barley, malted barley. But Matt Cunningham also malts. He grows some wheat, and you can malt wheat just like you can malt barley. And so we use some wheat in that, some of his wheat. And then on top of that, there's a lot of farmers who are getting into the honey business. We all know how important bees are to agriculture in general. And Nathan Davis out in DeGraff, Ohio, is collecting honey and marketing it. And so we use his honey. We add that to the kettle boil. And one thing that does is it allows us to ferment out the sugar. And maybe we don't capture all the flavor, but if I didn't do that, then I would be injected the honey later in the process. I would be a little bit at risking, kind of a re-fermentation after the beer is finished, and I really don't want that to happen. So, but his honey's great. It's organic, raw honey. He figures there's probably wildflower and then alfalfa, soy is what the bees are pollinating. So it's kind of a blend of those raw materials. But I think that beer really showcases also the kind of the terroir of Ohio and what the raw materials can do. So, once we get through that brewing process and the yeast just takes it away, the yeast will kind of expose certain flavors as it's fermenting the sugars out. The flavor of the beer kind of changes, but once it's done changing sugar into ethanol and flavors and CO2, the beers are ready to go. And so after that, we just throw it in a can or a keg. And I guess that's pretty much the gist of the process.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Thank you very much. I think if we can go to our next slide, please. So we've come to our questions and answers portion of the program today, and I have a question for Scott, if he's there. Scott, are you still in the tractor?
Yeah, I'm still here. Sorry.
Okay. We have a question here about, might be from another farmer. He said, what recommendations would you make to farmers who might be considering growing barley?
I guess probably the first thing I would say is, I guess if you haven't grown wheat in a while, or if you do grow wheat, it's very similar to wheat. A lot of the same practices you do are the same. It is more finicky than wheat. You need to kind of plant it on either tiled ground or gravel ground. But those would probably be two of the things I would recommend. I mean, like I said, it's similar to wheat, but at the same time, it's a little bit different. You do a lot of the same practices to it you do wheat. The timing may be just a little bit different on it. I guess I wouldn't hesitate to grow any of it. I don't know that I would grow, a large scale. We usually raise about 400 to 600 acres of wheat. And we've just, last 2 years, we've done just 100 acres of barley. So we're kind of easing our way into it. But I guess that's probably the biggest thing we've learned. The soil types that you have it on are pretty important. If it's tiled, that's tiled or gravelly ground where the water gets away from it, because it doesn't like water at all.
Okay, thank you, Scott. There was a question for Nick. How did you decide initially which hops to grow when you established your hop yard?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's a lot of factors to consider. For my wife and I, she's a high school ag teacher, and so while her summers are somewhat busier than normal teachers, when we go back to school, that's kind of a game changer for us. We want to be done with our harvest before school starts, and ideally before our fair. So our goal was to get early varieties, so that was a consideration for us. There are some research trials that Brad at Ohio State has done, and some other places as well. We checked into before we decided on anything. The growth habits in Ohio are very different from they are even in Michigan or New York or anywhere else. So having local research trials for us was very important. So we were watching those. Some varieties just do not grow well in Ohio, so those were kind of cut from the list immediately. And then other considerations were talking to brewers, things work out great. Sometimes they don't, in hindsight, if we knew that North High was going to want more Cascade, we could have planted more Cascade, but that came about way after we decided to start growing hops, and that wasn't a consideration at the time. So, if we'd grown over an acre of Cascade, we'd probably be okay. But having the ability to sell to different breweries and have our hops spread out to different places where our friends and family live across the state is very beneficial to us as well, and be able to share in that a little bit with them, because a lot of people have helped us to get started and be where we're at. So to be I'm from Northwest Ohio originally, and have some beers that are up there, and a lot of friends in Western Ohio and even around Cleveland. To be able to spread hops around a little bit helps us. And we have 6 different varieties, and the varieties that we have, Jason really doesn't want at North High. He may not have a beer that he can use it in, or we don't have enough quantity for him to use our hops for certain things. So a lot of considerations there, but talking to brewers and finding out what they want. If you're a hop grower in the state and you can't sell your hops within 50 miles of your house, there might be something wrong with your hops. Because one of the trivia questions, I don't want to give away the answer, but there are a lot of breweries in Ohio. There's plenty of opportunity there to be able to sell hops if you can do a quality job and have a quality product. So going and talking with your local brewers is probably the best and easiest thing to do when trying to decide what variety to grow.
Thanks, Nick. I have a question. We have a question for Jason. Jason, I think I'm going to put a little addition onto the question, but is there interest among brewmasters to increase wheat in beers? And then I'll follow up with another question you might want to address is, because of the current economic situations, where do you see craft beer, some of the struggles that craft brewers might have in the near future?
Okay. First part of the question about wheat. there's a lot of beers that that we can use wheat in. Wheat doesn't behave exactly like malted barley, even though it's most of the time it's malted. And so you can't really make a beer with 100% wheat. It doesn't have the husk like the barley does, and so the extraction process when you're trying to get the wort out of the mash, the wheat can really gum up the works. It tends to have a higher protein level as well, and so but I guess conversely, wheat can really provide some nice flavors, real softness. It kind of rounds out the malt bill and the backbone of the beer. And there's a lot of styles out there that absolutely critically have to have wheat in them to be legit, such as like a German Hefeweizen. You can't make a Hefeweizen without a ton of wheat. I use wheat when the style requires. I would say, most even wheat beers aren't more than 50% wheat. Honey wheat is about 25% wheat, which I think is kind of a nice blend for that beer. But certainly it plays a part. There's a big trend out there with hazy IPAs, and the protein in wheat sometimes is used to kind of increase the haze and that really complex dynamic that's going on with the haze and the hop character and all that. A lot of brewers use oats too when they're trying to make hazy beer, and actually I've found that oats do a better job of throwing a more permanent haze in interacting with the hops more than wheat does. But to each his own. I think they're either one can make a great hazy beer too. And then second question I think was about how are craft brewers doing with the pandemic, and I would say we're just trying to stay alive. Typically, us craft brewers, our fraction of sales is a lot higher in the on-premise category, which on-premise means bars and restaurants, versus off-premise, which would be grocery stores and carryouts and things like that for packaged beer. All of us are either 40 to 60% on-premise, or I guess up to 100% if you're a brew pub. I mean, if you're a brew pub and don't have the ability to package beer, then the brew pubs are probably the ones that are hurting the most. I mean, they're dead in the water unless they can do some growler sales. So they're probably the ones who are most urgently in need of opening up the on-premise market. When you look at Anheuser-Busch and the big macros, I used to work for Anheuser-Busch, and I recall at the brewery here in Columbus, they only maybe 8% of all the beer that is made there went into a keg. And so the vast majority of the beer that AB made here in Columbus, and I would say it's probably, the same for all the AB breweries across the country, vast majority goes into package. And so they're probably, if anything, they're having a field day right now because they're not reliant on draft beer sales like the small guys. So I mean, it's tough. It's really tough. I mean, we've tried to ramp up our canning production. I mean, every single batch of beer now only goes into cans, and we're just kind of like wait and see at this point. But it's been a real tough road to hoe for the last couple of months.
Okay, Jason, while we have you on, I got another question for you. How do you come up with new beer style ideas, and how do you tailor your recipe to the Midwestern palate?
Jason, I can help you answer that if you can start.
Okay.
I'll start. Yeah, and Kelsey's out in the market, way more than I am, but yeah, she can chime in, and she will probably also balance my this answer because I'm going to try to minimize my jadedness, but you're probably going to, it's probably going to show through. I've mentioned that I used to work for Anheuser-Busch and I used to work for Anchor. And so where I come from is obviously a lot bigger and, probably a lot less innovative. I mean, Anchor was very innovative in the 70s, but it became a very traditional type brewery by the time I was there in the 6 or 7 years ago. at this point in the craft beer industry, the innovation is basically just throwing a dart at a dartboard, and just brewers are just trying to unearth a new flavor any way they can, and it's in any ingredient. There's no ingredient is off the list. I mean, you could, and it's gotten really ridiculous, and I'm going to try to temper the negativity, but I'm not impressed with a brewer who throws Fruit Loops in a beer. That's not innovative at all, but yet they get national news because they threw Fruit Loops in a beer. I mean, it's insane. But I think, like the advent of the hazy IPA category, at first it seems kind of strange that we're going to throw away, potentially a couple hundred years of technique in making beer very bright and clear. But at the same time, it's really, it's all about discovering new flavors from these, our very few traditional ingredients that we have in malts and hops. And so I think it's been really interesting to see how much science is actually behind this extraction of hop flavor in hazy beers, and I've really come around on it. I mean, at first I was like, I don't get it, but after tasting some well-made hazies, it's a whole new world out there, and so it's really just trying anything we can. And I guess when it comes down to like the Midwestern palate, I mean, I think the beer trends have become plenty nationalized, where everybody's aware of everything that's happening anywhere in the country and or the world, and so and everybody's looking for the same thing, something new and something that they've never had before. I guess I'll hand it off to Kelsey and see if she has anything to add to that.
No, I mean, that was pretty well said. The beer trends kind of move from the coast in. So you can kind of see a trend on the east or west coast. The hazy IPAs were called New England style IPAs for a long time, because that's kind of where they quote unquote originated. There's a specific beer that they like the can specifically said, please drink from the can, because they couldn't make it clear. That used to be the thing. Beer needed to be clear because they didn't want you to know that they couldn't make it clear it was a hazy beer. And then all of a sudden that became the popular style. And so to Jason's point, Germany has this beer purity law where there's four ingredients, correct? 4 ingredients in beer. Am I right, Jason?
Yeah.
Yep. And so we're kind, and so the Germans are very, this is how you make beer. This is the law. And in the United States, it's like, to Jason's point, it's like, oh, let's throw cheesecake in this beer. Like, let's see how it turns out, and I think that, to Jason's point, at first it was, it's kind of irritating to watch like all this be thrown out the window, but then you have to realize that these brewers are working really hard to make these styles and these flavors all fit together, so that they are being unique, so that they are different, so that it's not, the same as, the breweries 3 doors down, especially because we have hundreds of breweries, in the state of Ohio now. And you don't want to make the same, you don't want to make the same beer as the next guy. And so you do have to be innovative, and you do have to think of flavoring, and, and I've watched our brewers sit down and, test out hops and, see how they work together, and test out flavoring and see how they work together, and then you just kind of, pray that that's the flavor, that's the flavor of the day, that is, what consumers are going to want. And then, to the Midwestern point, I guess, we do have the cover crop. We tailored that to farmers and to, Bud Light, Miller Lite drinkers as much as we could. So, I think that's where the Midwestern aspect comes in. But, I do feel, and there's nothing wrong with this, that, the innovation, and not that we're not innovative, but it does kind of come from the East and West Coast, because that's where the majority of the ingredients are coming from. And then it kind of moves itself inwards.
Thanks, Kelsey, and thanks, Jason. We have another question in the box, but I want to go ahead and advance to the next slide and get a little bit of a few things done before we go to it. So again, I noticed at the beginning of the program, we talked about supporting our servers and our brewers. if you want to take an opportunity to look at these and jot this down, anything you can do to help these folks out would be appreciated at this time. Next slide, please. Again, I want to also make sure to give a big shout out and a thanks to the sponsors that provided their expertise, their social platforms to promote the program here tonight. And we've got a chance now to announce the trivia winners. So that's not my responsibility tonight, but I know they need to get emails to someone. So I guess I'll turn it to Kelsey.
Yeah, thanks. Hang on just a second. All right. So I'll read the trivia question, I'll announce the answer, and then I'll tell you the winner. So the first question was, what is Ohio's #1 industry? Our #1 industry is agriculture. This is where I'm going to get on my little soapbox and ask that you stop developing land so that we can keep it. Our number one industry. Jeremy McKinney was the first one to answer with agriculture. The next question was, about 50% of Ohio is classified as farmland. Where do we rank in the nation? We are 5th. Mallory Zachrich was the first one to answer that correctly. The next question was, hops have been used in beer since the 9th century. In the 21st century, we use hops for bittering and flavor. What was their initial purpose? Preservative. Hops were initially put in beer as a preservative when they would be put on the ships, and the water was so unclean that they would drink the beer, so they would throw the hops in there as a preservative. Megan Yanni was the first one to answer that correctly. My next question, I must have not phrased it correctly. No one got that correct. Hops are grown on bines, B-I-N-E, not vines, not trellis, vines. And again, commercial hop farms are made up of only female plants. You got to get those females in there if you want to get it right. In 2018, Ohio produced 1.4 million barrels of beer. We were ranked 4th in beer production in the United States. What 3 states produce more beer than Ohio? No one got that correct. Michael Cooper was the first one to name Colorado and California. Pennsylvania is the 3rd state. So it's Colorado, California, and Pennsylvania, and then Ohio ranks 4th. We rank 4th. We cheat a little bit. We have a Sam Adams brewery in Cincinnati, so that's where our numbers get pulled up a little bit. And we also have the Budweiser plant here in Columbus. Approximately how many breweries are in Ohio? Michael Cooper, I said that, sorry. Approximately how many breweries are in Ohio? As of December 2019, there were 314. Laura McCabe was the closest one to that. So she was the winner of that. What crop is malt made from? The answer was barley. Mallory and Jeremy had already gotten questions correct, so Andrew Stella was the next one to answer that correctly. Malt produces what ingredient that is fermentable by yeast to produce alcohol? Sugar. Thomas Thatcher got that one correct. North High was founded in what year? We were founded in 2011. Our founders, Gavin and Tim, will tell you that they founded North High in 2011 because that's when they went home and told their wives that they were quitting their corporate jobs with health insurance to start a brewery. We officially opened December 28th of 2012, so we are in our 8th year of business. Brian Himes got that one correct. And then in 2016, our Pale Ale took home a silver medal at the World Beer Cup, the American Pale Ale category. At the time, that was the 3rd most popular category behind IPAs and double IPAs. I believe that there were 169 entries that year, and we got 2nd. We got silver, and Ben Garberick got that correct. So, oh, you're welcome, Andrew. I never won anything either, so I understand how it's so exciting. Anyways, thank you guys all so much for coming tonight. I hope you all learned something. I get to work closely with Whitney and Zach and Scott and Jason, so I'm always very fortunate for that. But I always learn something new every time I get to hear them present. So I hope you guys learned something tonight. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you again for attending. We appreciate it.
Okay, we just had one last question, and I guess it was from Thomas, wanting to know about hazy IPAs. What is the benefit? What is the different flavor?
They are, and Jason can jump in and help me out if he wants. So they have a more pillowy mouthfeel, and they take on a more juicy flavor as opposed to a standard IPA or a double IPA where you're going to get that bitterness from the hop flavor.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Yeah,
I'd like to think, first of all, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, IPAs, like the West Coast style IPA used to be the big one, and that was, had a much more bracing bitterness. And so the New England style was much more about the aroma versus the bitterness. And so there's been a bunch of recipe changes that have gone in to accentuate aroma and de-accentuate bitterness. But so that's the gist. That's what I would add.
Thank you. I'd like to thank, first of all our presenters tonight for taking time out. But again, I'd really like to thank all the people that took time out today to join us. And I guess it's just in closing, we'd like to say cheers and good beer. So at this point, we were going to conclude our webinar. Thank you very much.